Alright, so first pickups video of the new year. I'm pretty excited because I did get some pretty good stuff in January. And now before we get too far into February and I start exploring, the games are going to be coming out this month and, stocking up on even more games to check out in list style formats. First, let's take a look back at some of the games that I grabbed in January. And the first one that I picked up is actually not one that I picked up, rather it was provided to me by the publisher, and that would be Stuffed. Now, normally I don't do a ton of publisher-provided showcases or anything like that, and it's not because I'm opposed to it or anything. It's just that normally there's a whole lot of red tape and hoops you have to jump through if you want to get a key for a game and check it out. But thankfully, the people who made Stuffed made it incredibly easy. So they pretty much just gave me a code and were like, here, just go have a blast and check it out. So that's exactly what I did. And I have to say, I think there's something really special here. So the premise behind Stuffed is essentially that you are a stuffed teddy bear that belongs to a child, and while they sleep, it is your job to keep her safe. And you do that by basically cobbling together a variety of sort of makeshift childlike weapons to keep a variety of weird little enemies at bay, whether that's like gnomes or rubber ducks or creepy shadow monsters that seem to be able to do the most damage to the bedroom door that you are tasked with protecting. But at its core, it is sort of a cutesy horde mode kind of game. I will say there's an awful lot of tutorializing at the beginning, so it does take some time to get used to as you start to understand the different core mechanics of the game, namely things like you're going to start in a randomly generated environment each time, there are resources scattered about that you have to kind of keep yourself piled up with if you want to be able to continue to protect Ellie, and then finally, of course, you have to be ready for successive waves of enemies that gradually ramp up in difficulty to make sure that you can, again, keep Ellie safe and keep the monsters at bay. So yeah, my initial impressions are that, again, as a goosebumpsy sort of horde mode game that you could play co-op with friends, I think this shows a lot of promise. Definitely some rough edges to sand down, I would say, mostly because I think the interface can be a little bit cluttered. Also, I was only really able to play this single player because every time I tried to find a multiplayer game, I could not find other players to play with, and that's a shame because, again, I think there's something really, really cool here. I just really like the idea of playing a game that is kind of a horror game, but not so terrifying that it'll be off-putting to younger players, I guess. And it seems to have all the trappings of a game in this vein that would do pretty well in the marketplace. And I say that mostly because there is a good sense of progression and a lot of unlockables that you can continue to accrue as you gain more and more points from surviving, more and more successive waves and rounds of trying to protect Ellie. Movement and shooting and tossing grenades all feels pretty solid for the most part. Now, I will say, as far as performance goes on the Steam Deck, it was definitely not the best game that I played this month in terms of performance. It tended to waver a lot between 30 and 60 frames per second whenever it was on some of the higher graphical settings, but if you drop it down to something like low or even potato mode, you'll get a frame rate that is much closer to 60, obviously, so really that's just a trade-off that you'll have to think about. But yeah, I'm really curious to see how this game does moving forward because I personally really enjoyed it, and I like the idea of just, playing as a teddy bear and keeping random terrifying toys at bay and protecting my human. But yeah, thanks again to the devs and publisher for offering me a key to this so I could showcase it a little bit in this video. Also, if you'd like to play it yourself, there is a link down below in the description. I believe the first 3 or 4 people that grab that link and snatch up a copy of Stuffed for free, so if you want to go ahead and check it out for yourself, that is your chance to do so. But now on to the next game, which I did actually grab after I saw a ton of people playing this and random clips on YouTube, and it is one specific scary section that I really wish I had not run across because honestly, as soon as I saw it, I was like, man, I really would have loved to experience that moment by myself, so I won't spoil it here, but I will say that the next game on my list is Fears to Fathom Ironbark Lookout. Now, technically I bought the entire collection of all of the Fears to Fathom games, but Ironbark Lookout, because I had seen such a positive reception to it from so many content creators, I figured that would be the one that I would try first. I have not had a chance to dive into the others yet, but at least my initial time with just this particular episode has been a whole lot of fun. For starters, it does a really great job at building up tension because it opens with you kind of having a slow, meandering drive to the Ironbark Lookout in your RV, with a brief stop off along the way to check some of your messages and hit up a local diner. Although I will say one of the things I did not like so much about this game right off the bat was I actually got my RV stuck on an embankment and had to restart the entire game. Thankfully that was only like 2 minutes into the game, but yeah, I think it's natural to assume there's going to be some level of jank whenever you're talking about a low poly, again, 5th gen kind of horror affair, but yeah, I just thought that was kind of funny. And sort of true to genre norms, I guess, for the low poly horror aesthetic, this, from a technical perspective, does not look like a great game, but then again, that is by design, and what it lacks in technical prowess, it more than makes up for in its ability to build a terrifying atmosphere. And even though you are in a sort of wide open environment when you finally get to your destination, even though it feels sort of wide and expansive, it also somehow feels incredibly oppressive, and I think that only gets worse as the nights drag on. Now, there are definitely a few jump scares peppered in here and there, but I don't think they're used excessively or in a way that, would just sort of diminish the experience overall. And also, I should point out that I am keeping this opening footage a little bit vague, because this is not a very long game, right? This is bite-sized horror that you can probably knock out in about an hour or two, and I would just really hate to spoil anything for you the way it kind of got spoiled for me, so if you've heard absolutely nothing about Ironbark, look out. I would go in blind. I'm not spoiling anything significant with any of this footage here. I'm just saying that, you're going to be a park ranger who is acting as a lookout, and some kind of spooky stuff starts to go down. Now, as far as performance on the Steam Deck, it's kind of so-so with a lot of fluctuations at its default Ultra setting, so if you really demand a smooth experience, you'll want to toy with these a little bit. Although I will say that personally I left it at this setting because lo-fi 5th gen throwback sort of games are probably the type of game where stutters and slowdown feel most appropriate to me, and it really didn't detract from my enjoyment of my time with Ironbark Lookout at all. And again, these games always tend to seem a little bit rough by design, whether that's with interface elements or the graphics themselves, but again, if you are a fan of exactly this type of subgenre of horror, you're probably going to love this. And speaking of wooded outdoorsy environments, although on a much grander scale, this next game is one that I played a few years back on the PlayStation 4 originally, and I think it was on sale, so I went ahead and grabbed it again, and mostly it was prevalent when I was testing that Arzopa monitor from a couple weeks back, but that would be Far Cry 5. And I've been a little apprehensive about even including it here because the performance was kind of dicey on the Steam Deck when I was doing the testing on that monitor. But ultimately, I played through Far Cry 6 with my dad a while back and loved it, and of all the Far Crys I've played, this is definitely one of my favorites. And I don't know if I would call Ubisoft's open world collectathons especially deep, but honestly, for me, Ubisoft open world games are kind of a Chipotle burrito of a game. And what I mean by that is whenever you tear into a game like this, you're reasonably confident of what you're going to experience, and even when it's not the best, it's still a pretty good time. Like, it's not the best burrito you could have had in the world, but again, as open world collectathons go, I've always found them to be pretty fun with, lots to see, lots of flexibility to stealth up on your prey and dispatch them quietly, or you could go in guns blazing, or you could take like an in-between approach where you're setting up traps for your enemies and just creating chaos among their ranks. And the setting, while not strictly speaking horror, is a little bit chilling considering you are going up what is essentially a blood-crazed cult trying to, sow some terroristic activities in the heart of America. That is kind of terrifying stuff. But again, I'm a little bit biased here, and I've always found these types of games to be pretty enjoyable, even if, again, they're not the deepest experiences you can have in an open world. On the performance front, I could not get this game to a solid 60 FPS even after scaling back things like motion blur and anti-aliasing. However, you should be able to manage a pretty solid 40 to 50 frames most of the time, so this is definitely a good candidate for locking down that refresh rate to 40. And my only other real complaint with checking out Far Cry 5 on the Steam Deck is, as a Ubisoft game or one of those top-tier AAA publisher-style games, it does have a goofy launcher that you're going to have to mess with a little bit. It wasn't that intrusive once I got set up, but there was a part at first where it kept kind of hassling me about my graphics card driver and leaving a notification on screen, and I couldn't get rid of it until I went digging around in the settings to remove that. But yeah, aside from that one minor inconvenience, it's still pretty solid open-world fun, although, again, a game like this is going to chew through your battery pretty quickly, so you'll want to play tethered, docked, or just keep a backup battery nearby. Next up, moving on to something that is definitely more story-rich, although again, this is the type of game that really plays more like an interactive movie than anything, would be a game that I have wanted to play from Quantic Dream from some time, but just kept not getting around to it, and I finally did, and that is Detroit: Become Human. Now, if you've played these games before, you know this is really less of a game and more of like a quick-time event storybook. In it, you'll be leaping into the future to the year 2038 in Detroit, where you'll play intermittently as either Marcus, Kara, or Connor, each of whom is an android serving society in a different way, and each has their own story to explore that I suspect will gradually intertwine. If you've played a Quantic Dream game before, you have some idea of what to expect, as, again, these are less games and more walking simulators / interactive movies. Sometimes you'll have to think pretty quickly to respond to on-screen prompts depending on what action is going on, but the goal of these games isn't so much to win as it is to experience an interesting story. In that regard, I'd say that Detroit: Become Human mostly succeeds, although I will say that a lot of its allegory is about as subtle as a freight train. But still, as somebody who grew up reading and watching a lot of sci-fi, I'm really enjoying it so far, and considering I just wrapped up Asimov's Foundation Season 2, I'm definitely ready for more sci-fi storytelling, particularly if it revolves around androids. I'm not so sure that David Cage is breaking any exceptionally new ground here, but it's enjoyable enough if you like those type of experiences. Now, from a performance standpoint, this does not do very well on the Steam Deck, and it really struggles to keep up with this game, so if you're going to grab Detroit: Become Human for yourself, you might want to grab it on the PS4 or a regular desktop PC, because no matter what combination of settings I tried, the deck just struggled to stay at a consistent 30, let alone 40 or 60 for a smooth experience. I mean, you could probably still play it this way, but I wouldn't recommend it. But regardless of how you play it, if you're a fan of sci-fi, you're probably going to enjoy Detroit Become Human. I know I'm enjoying it so far. There's just something inherently interesting about watching the evolution of both machine and man and how those sort of play out together. Obviously, this is a story whose quality is largely going to depend on the choices that you make, but thankfully it does make it pretty easy to go back and see what choices you made in the branching narrative that it presents, which should allow you to adjust course accordingly on a subsequent playthrough fairly easily. And finally, to round this list out, is a game that probably ended up being my favorite, kind of a surprise favorite because I was not expecting to enjoy it as much as I did, and that is Tinykin. Now this popped up on my recommended, and at first I just didn't want anything to do with this game because it looked like a minion management game, not too unlike Pikmin, and while I like the original Pikmin, I just never really kept up with the series and just sort of assumed I wouldn't like it because I hadn't enjoyed a minion management game since like Overlord on the Xbox 360, which was like 20 years ago. Oof, that is not comfortable to say out loud. But because Tinykin was on sale, I figured I would go ahead and roll the dice, and I'm really glad that I did because this is just an extremely polished platformer. The premise is that you'll be playing as an archaeologist and researcher named Milidane along with his assistant Nevis from the planet Aegis. But even though he's human, his researchers concluded that humanity is not from Aegis, but rather someplace else across the universe. After finding a signal of human origin from a nearby galaxy, they decide they're going to go investigate and uncover the secret of humanity's beginnings. And in no time, you'll be jumping, bubble gliding, and soap skating all over these massive environments while you yourself are very tiny. And as the name suggests, you'll also be running across different Tinykin that you can befriend, which each have their own abilities that can be deployed to solve environmental puzzles. And what makes this pretty great in my eyes so far is just that all of the traversal feels really good, which is exactly what I want in a 3D platformer. I kinda wish the bubble glide maneuver was a little more forgiving with the time between tapping A again to activate it, but that's a pretty minor complaint. And also, I really like the presentation on offer here because they've opted for these really sort of candy-coated 3D rendered environments, but then they've used sort of 2D character models, which is a really interesting juxtaposition. Now, this isn't the first time I've seen this technique used, obviously. I think that's been pretty standard in games like Paper Mario and also in Demon's Turf, which I picked up last year, but it just looks really, really good here, and just overall, it looks great, it feels good to play, it has sickeningly cute animated cutscenes that punctuate the journey, and for all of this, it runs at a solid 60 FPS on the deck without breaking a sweat. And honestly, again, I think I sort of saved the best for last year because out of all the games that I picked up in January, I'm pretty sure the Tinykin's coming out on top as my favorite. Alright, so that's it for this one, but hey, what about you? Did you grab anything particularly awesome in the month of January? If so, I would love to hear about it because if you're new around here, I do read every single comment, and whenever you guys make recommendations for games that you think that I should check out, I always write it down or I screenshot it and then make it a point to add those to my wish list later to check them out. So thank you for all of your suggestions. And as always, thanks so much for your time, take care, and I'll see you on the next one.